Thank you for joining us. I'm Tom Callahan. I'm Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and Evaluation at CRDF Global. And before introducing our guests, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is off the record and under Chatham House rules. If you do wish to have a publishable quote, please contact the speakers directly, or you can reach out through my colleague, Yusuf Babanli, for contact information. Taking advantage of today's remote format, you may insert questions into the Q&A box that you will see at the bottom of your screen as they occur to you, either during the speaker's opening remarks or after we've moved into the interview question and answer session. Yusuf will keep track of them and may consolidate those with overlapping themes. Both of our guests today hail from Canada, and more specifically from British Columbia, where the heavens have apparently opened and they are experiencing some flooding, mudslides, and other signs of the apocalypse. Hopefully we will not lose contact, but thank you, gentlemen, both for being here, not only during the early morning hour of Pacific time, but also with everything else going on out there. Stephen Hess is the principal of CSS Chemical Security Strategies, a consultancy to industry and government, and has held several senior positions in private and corporate security in North America and the Middle East. His career has included police and government service in Canada, and he has served as president of the International Association of Security and Investigative Regulators. He was the past director of corporate security and crisis management for Nutrient, based in Calgary, the world's largest chemical fertilizer producer and agriculture retailer. Steve holds a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master's of Education degrees from University of British Columbia and certificates from the Canadian Police College in Advanced Police Studies and the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in Terrorism Studies. David Toddington is founder and CEO of Toddington International, with a background as a senior manager in the IT industry and with frontline experience in national security, police, and military operations. David and his team have developed a number of very effective training programs for frontline investigative and research professionals. Their emphasis is on using cutting-edge open source intelligence tools in conjunction with advanced critical thinking methodologies to produce superior intelligence products. Among other awards, David received a Royal Canadian Mounted Police Commanding Officer's Commendation for his work in developing and implementing new police open source intelligence systems. A dual Canada and UK national, David is special advisor to the commercial crime section of the International Chamber of Commerce in London and provides training and consulting services to organizations in the financial, petrochemical, manufacturing, and pharmaceutical sectors. Some of you may also recognize David from seasons 1, 2, and 3 of Hunted, a very interesting UK-produced reality television show which has been syndicated all over the world, that shows just how challenging it is for ordinary people to disappear off the grid in modern society. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for being with us today, even as the floodwaters rise above your feet there in BC. And I think both of you have opening remarks, presentations. Stephen, if we can, let's begin with you.
Very good. Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction. I'm going to go through the screen share piece here, and hopefully this works the way it's supposed to. And we'll go over here, and we'll hit slideshow. Is it working?
Yes.
You can see my slide. You can see my slides. Awesome. Great. Well, again, Tom, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm pleased to be here today to talk to everyone here about a topic that I believe in very strongly, promoting effective interaction between and among industry and government. I briefly scanned the list of folks who are on the call today, and I'm very pleased to see some of the folks that I've had in sessions before, and some of my friends in different countries, some of the folks here from Iraq, Desir in Beirut, Jeff from the States, I see you there, and Rohan from OPCW. So to all of you, welcome today, and I'm very happy to have been asked by CRDF to make a few comments today. I come to this presentation, effective chemical security, chemical supply chain security, embracing behavioral change, from roles in police, government regulation, and the chemical industry. So I've had the opportunity to see and share all sides of these issues, including some of the failings. One of the things that I enjoy most about the audiences that I've had in CRDF chemical security trainings is the variety in the room. Invariably, there are engineers, chemists, salespeople, security professionals, logistics folks, people from government officials to business to state security agencies. And most often I see them being very, very appreciative of the CRDF programs they access. The work of each of those groups is different, but the context is the same: the safe and secure production, movement, and the business of chemicals. What I find, however, with almost every audience is that there continue to be gaps between groups that can inhibit effective security in the big picture, particularly in relation to small and medium-sized enterprises. Effective chemical industry security is more than the sum of its parts and groups, and that's why I believe that ensuring chemical security is really more appropriately thought of as public safety. The context I'm speaking about today is in relation to the interaction of all the partners involved. I take the position that effective security at all levels is vital to securing the chemical supply chain, and that it's the responsibility of all parties working together. And that starts with understanding relationships. And you can see on the slide here, I talk about 3 different relationships: private to private relationships, companies working with each other or in competition with each other; public to public relationships, the multiple levels and agencies of government involved with the chemical industry, whether we're talking about regulators, enforcement people, public security agencies; and public to private relationships, that third set that we often think about, the interaction of industry and government in the business of the chemical industry. Each of these partners has a specific role to play in chemical security, but it's not enough for them to do their work in a vacuum. Whether the partner is a chemical company, a government regulator, or a state security agency such as the police, in order for each to be fully effective, they need to fully understand, appreciate, and cooperate with the others. And I point out the word here, cooperate, is tempered with the words as much as possible. These relationships that I'm talking about are complex. They involve power structures, business competitions, big egos, and even corruption. And I don't suggest that these relationships are easy or that they're quick to establish. They may even be discouraged by different sides, but there are ways to break down barriers and move to more effective relationships and be able, as I've mentioned there, to be able to work in harmony. Fundamental to this effectiveness is a common understanding of terms, responsibilities, roles, and benefits. Each partner needs to know what the other uses as terms and technical language, what the specific roles of each is, what their level of responsibility is, and what the benefits are of working together. And this is often, I find, where the development of relationships seems to hit a snag, and is an understanding that everyone has to have an understanding of what the other does. One of the most common misunderstandings that I've observed is that a basic understanding of physical security concepts is not always well understood by all partners. And the example that I show on the screen there is the one that I see most often. It's often assumed that public security agencies are well versed in security practices or corporate needs, but this isn't always true. We assume that because someone represents a public security agency, that they've received some kind of training or have a background or experience in physical security, but this isn't always true. And I count myself in this category. When I made the transmission from government service and police to the private sector, I freely admit that I had limited knowledge of either. I did, however, have an opportunity for exposure with additional training. So we have to assume that that what we might think about one or the other partner in this public safety enterprise is not always what they seem to be. Even within chemical companies, there can be limited understanding of how even basic security principles can help a company with business, process improvement, resilience, and continuity. And I know that the folks that are listening today who have that role in corporate security will appreciate what I'm saying here, that it's often difficult to get companies themselves and your own employers to appreciate and understand how basic security principles can help you manage the organization itself. And these are often areas that go, or responsibilities that go well beyond the actual cost of security. The competitive nature of business means that companies often look only at the bottom line when it comes to security. And in my view, this is a false economy. As a corporate security director, I take the approach that as much as possible, I have to be able to understand the business and quantify how security helps the business, even if this means working collaboratively with security colleagues in other companies. Misunderstandings such as these can and do have a negative effect on all of the partners in chemical security and what they really need to do, which is that message that I promote of public safety. Misunderstanding can cause havoc in the security chain, and goodness knows we have enough of that these days. Internal and external security, business, and even a national economy. And we've seen where in the relatively recent past, where breakdowns in security and public safety have had impacts on national economy. Unfortunately, it also can lead to inefficient government oversight, both in terms of over and under regulation. And it may seem odd to have a corporate person talk about under regulation, but it's my experience, in my view, that effective oversight, and the operative word there being effective, is an important component to corporate security and public safety. So what can we do? What can all of us do to promote better understanding and a better overall security environment? In many cases, business and government look first to security technology as a solution, but I take a slightly different approach to that. I often counsel companies and governments that are looking to improve chemical security to first take a backward-looking approach, an approach that can be both more effective, in my view, and less costly. And that starts with 3 steps. The first is relationship building, taking the time to appreciate the importance of each partner, finding common ground to see what everyone's most important objectives are, and finding ways to truly work together. And I can't emphasize the word truly enough, because this is an area where truly is an area where lip service is often given, and it's not the notion of recognizing and appreciating the importance of others' roles isn't necessarily fully done, and that needs to change. And in my view, this is the most important step of the 3 that we'll talk about. It involves a relaxation of egos, which is not always something easy to do with some of the groups that we're talking about, and I'm happy to include my own group in that as well. The second step is to look at how security fits into a well-constructed supply chain, and ensuring that basic steps are looked after before moving into complex and expensive technology. I'm not suggesting here for a second that modern security technology isn't important, and I know David is going to talk a little bit about security technology coming up, and I don't want to take the emphasis away from security technology, but there are many non-technical measures that are often overlooked in some environments. Strategies such as know your customer or responsible care that have been developed by industry can, if they're properly introduced and properly implemented, inform how security measures are implemented. While these two programs are just a couple of examples of some of the ones and are amongst the most widely used, I continue to be surprised that there are many places where they're not either fully accepted or fully implemented. The third step is looking at public oversight measures that both recognize the importance and the economic and social benefits of the chemical industry, while at the same time providing effective public safety. In my observations, companies may not always fully appreciate the security role of public agencies and private industry's responsibility to contribute to public safety. At worst, they're often looked at as roadblocks to business, but that can change. And at the same time, public agencies may not always appreciate that many companies do have an interest in effective security and the importance of business resilience to a nation's economy. It may seem that what I'm proposing and what I'm talking about here is too simplistic. In a world where security is often driven by technology, that being said, I'm under no illusions that all security problems can be solved by dialogue. Still, we need to take a strategic view here. Effective chemical security is not a short-term issue, and it's not in our long-term best interest to only act in our short-term self-interest. Effective chemical industry security is complex. It's a complex business. We only need to look at the rapid increase in cybersecurity issues to see just how complex it is these days. But I encourage you to look at the basics first. Relationship building, understanding basic security concepts, and contributing to efficient oversight are, in my view, the very foundations of effective chemical security. I've been able to see firsthand how applying and constantly reinforcing these foundations has helped companies not only provide better security and public safety, but contribute to better corporate and business relationships and contribute to working smarter. The foundations that I've talked about are cost-effective, and they provide, in my view, a better working relationship between all security partners. I believe that they're often underappreciated as a corporate, or as a contribution rather, to corporate and business resilience, and ultimately lead to what should be the goal of all of us, which is private or public safety. So with that, thank you very much for your kind attention. As Tom mentioned, I'll be happy to field questions later, or if you want to reach out afterwards, I'll be happy to answer them after the session. Tom?
Stephen, thank you so much for setting the table so beautifully, and a reminder to bring it back to basic principles and the psychological parts of this, of, you know, having a little empathy for folks in other positions and leaving your ego at the side. David Toddington, you know, because he is not an egotistical guy, I do have to say on his behalf that you know, when he leaves us this morning, you know, this morning his time, he will be going off to do search and rescue in the hills and mountains around Vancouver, because he is a man of many parts, and we are so grateful to have you today, and good luck, David, to in your next endeavor the rest of the day. We know that some lives may be dependent on this, on your success. Please, David.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and you're far too kind and far too generous. I just want to clearly point that out as we get started here. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and it's also a great pleasure to be working with my colleagues again at CRDF, in addition to Steve Hess. And I think, Steve, you and I first met each other about 25 years ago, working in education around policing, a very important task and a goal. Now, what I want to talk about this morning, for me anyway, is something a little bit different. Steve has talked about the importance, and I think this bears repeating, the importance of private and public sector partnerships. And one thing that really resonated with what Steve just said as well, and that is to be very careful about making assumptions when working with a member of a government agency that somehow they have this deep insight into the intelligence or investigative world. That is not always the case. What my point really here is that it is incumbent upon all of us to do a much better job of know your customer, know your customer's customers, as we're going to talk about in just a moment, and to take responsibility for chemical security. We can't always depend on other organizations to be doing everything. We have to take responsibility in this very important regard. Now, getting into know your customer, I mean, that one is pretty obvious and straightforward. We do it all the time, and it could be done as a proactive measure to prevent chemicals from falling into the wrong hands. It can also be an important part of the process of making a sale, business intelligence. So what I'm talking about right now, and the job of gathering intelligence and analyzing intelligence, doesn't always have to be a cost center for a business. There are significant benefits here as well. As I say, business intelligence is one of the very important byproducts of all of this. So when it comes to KYC, verifying the identity of who it is we are dealing with, are they really who they say they are? Now, keep in mind as well, one very important challenge I'm going to make to you here is it's important to consider that the people that we are dealing with could be very adept, very skilled at, and making great effort to deceive us. So we've got to be very careful about how we do this KYC work, making sure that we're not just seeing what we want to see in order to close a sale, but we're actually really doing the job of making sure that these people are who they say they are. Important to consider as well when it comes to transnational organized crime, and I believe that based on some evidence that I've seen, that even state actors who are under embargo trying to acquire certain chemical products are employing these same techniques, layering company upon company. So we can't really see who it is that we are dealing with. And this is where KYCC, know your customer's customer, in the intelligence world, we would call this non-obvious relationship analysis, or NORA, also becomes very important as well. Now, open source intelligence is when we're using publicly available sources to find information, and it's available to all of us. The internet is the biggest source of open source intelligence that is out there. But again, we've got to be very careful how we use it. It's been really kind of dumbed down. It seems easy to do. Google is so ubiquitous, it's now become a verb. I'm going to go and Google a company, or I'm going to go and Google a person. It seems easy, but there's so much more actually to it. So we have to consider how we go about mining information online. And when you are out there searching the internet, you can often find yourself feeling a little bit like the guy in this photograph as well. As Mitch Karpour says, getting information off the internet is a little bit like drinking from a fire hydrant. Consider the huge amount of information out there. It's often said that from the dawn of civilization to the year 2003, humanity created some 5 exabytes of data. These days, we're creating 5 exabytes of data on this planet every other day, and a huge portion of that is winding up on the internet. In fact, how much information is going to be available to us as we move into the future? It's estimated that by the year 2025, so just 4 years from now, there's going to be about 175 zettabytes of data on the planet. 1 zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes of information. Think of the internet as the world's largest repository of information, albeit a repository of information where there's no librarians, no Dewey Decimal System to help us actually find what it is we're looking for. We need to apply a new way of thinking when it comes to how we search online. The first question is, where should we end up searching? We've talked about Google, and that seems to be the obvious go-to, but there's so much more than that. Now, as to how big the World Wide Web is, we don't really know for sure. We do have some statistics. What we can say is about 13 years ago, Google announced that they had discovered some 100 trillion web pages as a result of their deep web crawling. Now, what's interesting here is if we consider, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that we are still dealing with 100 trillion web pages, the Google index is only a very small portion of that. So even though Google has found that information, the size of the Google index is, again, a small portion, somewhere in the range of about 27 billion pages as of last month. Now, the surface web is one of the things that we search, and we use search engines like Baidu, Yandex, Google, and others to locate information on the surface web. But we also have to think about, when it comes to where we search, the deep web. It's estimated that the deep web is some 400 to 550 times larger than the surface web. Think of it as an information iceberg. That is the internet. You'll notice the iceberg graphic that I have in the corner of this slide. What you see above the surface of the ocean, and we often talk about the tip of the iceberg, the tip being the smallest portion, yet that's the piece that we end up seeing. The tip of this information iceberg, this is what Google is able to find. The larger portion of the information out there, however, is beneath the surface of the ocean. And this is what constitutes the deep web. And it's everything from databases, forums, things like dynamic content, non-textual files. Often it could be an image that gives us the information that we're actually looking for, as opposed to a document. Now, going from the surface web to the deep web, we then start moving into social media, what we would classify as Web 2.0. The easy way to think about this is it's anything that involves collaboration among users and also user-generated content. So something like YouTube would fall into the category of Web 2.0. People are creating their own videos. And a few years ago, Google announced that YouTube had approximately 500 hours of video uploaded every 60 seconds. Just think about that for just a moment in terms of the volume of information. 500 hours of video every 60 seconds uploaded just to YouTube. So user-generated content, and then also collaboration among users as well. So the kinds of discussions that end up ensuing as a result of a video posting in the comments threads, for example. We also then have to consider the dark web. Now, this is the more difficult area of the internet to start to access. It requires specialized tools. It requires specialized skills and specialized techniques, but there's a huge amount of information that can be found on the dark web, including breached information as well. This is very important, in my opinion, for companies to be aware of what personally identifying information on employees, what information may be available on the company as a result of data breaches are on the dark web, because this could constitute a very real threat to the organization. So from a threat intelligence perspective, this is something that we absolutely cannot ignore. Now we go from where we should search to how we should search. It's just not good enough to go to Google, enter in a few keywords, and hope for the best on the results that we end up getting back. Now, when we think about how we search, let's just give some thought to a moment to the digital population. Language is really quite important. Now, if you are an English speaker, you are fortunate when it comes to searching the internet, because it's estimated that approximately 25% or a quarter of internet users speak English. What is interesting is that year in, year out, the percentage of English speakers online is gradually decreasing, and we do see a gradual increase in the number of Chinese-speaking internet users. In third place, Spanish, then we move into Arabic, Indonesian, and Malaysian, Portuguese, and Japanese. Keep in mind there are some 7,000 languages on the planet today, with a few disappearing on a weekly basis. But that gives us a lot of options in terms of how we end up searching. 63% of internet content on the World Wide Web is in English, but then there's a huge amount of Russian content, Turkish content, Spanish, and other languages as well. So in terms of how we ask the question, we've really got to think about the way, the language, and the methodologies we can use for, in this example, entering someone's name, how we enter a name into a search engine. So I've taken the name John Doe, And there's different ways of expressing the name John Doe as we enter it into a search engine, especially when we're dealing with common names where we get collisions between people of the same name. It can make things a little bit more difficult to identify who it is we are researching. So we have to be very creative. We have to think really and truly outside the box. So John Doe, Johnny Doe, we might think of reversing the names. We have to think about the middle name. And notice what I've done here as well. I've included the version of John Doe in Cyrillic, in Hebrew, and also Arabic characters as well. Always keep in mind that spider-based search technology is essentially dumb. Search engines can't evaluate context. They don't understand the meaning of the keywords that you enter in. So here's my important challenge to you when it comes to doing online searching. I challenge you not to expect the search engine to think like you do, but rather for you to think like the search engine. That, if you're able to master that skill, is where you're going to be truly successful. And what this really comes down to is the importance of critical thinking, both proactively and reactively. True, we live in an information-based society where information is now the commodity of greatest value, and information and communications technology infrastructure is any organization's most important strategic asset, and we could also argue critical infrastructure as well. But we also live in an age of misinformation, disinformation, of propaganda, and malinformation as well. And that process of going from data, grouping data together to get information, and then contextualizing that information to get us to knowledge. We want to be making knowledge-based decisions, not data-based decisions. Critical thinking is half of the equation, a full half. So half of what's important is tools and techniques for finding information online. The second half is how we end up thinking about this. So again, just to reiterate, we don't want to be making data-based decisions, and there is a difference between data and information. We want to be making knowledge-based decisions. So this is when we use our inductive and our deductive reasoning skills to be able to correctly analyze information. And very often we won't have a clear answer in the terms of a deductive argument, for example. It may be very much inductive, that it's a balance of probabilities in terms of the information that we are putting forward that a decision maker is then going to use to make a decision. But what's important is that we can articulate the degree of probability of the conclusion that we have come to, and that we have also tested our conclusion as well. When it comes to online searching, I go back to the words of Sir John Lubbock, a Victorian English scientist, polymath, and politician, when he says this, that what we see depends mainly on what we are looking for. So think about this from a perspective of enhanced due diligence and know your customer. You're dealing with someone who wants to make a large purchase of some chemicals that could potentially be used for ill purpose. And we don't really know this entity, this individual, or this particular company. And we then decide to go about conducting some research, some enhanced due diligence. Now, here's an important question. What are we looking for? Are we looking for indicators that this could be a bad actor? Or are we looking to satisfy ourselves that all is good, all is right, and we should absolutely make this purchase, or this sale rather? How we approach this is going to have a significant impact on the results that we wind up finding. So as Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, know yourself and know your enemy, 1,000 battles to be won. Knowing who it is that we're researching is important, but knowing how we are researching is also very important as well. Understanding our motivations. And the first part of this quote applies here. In this world, we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. So how we interpret what it is that we are seeing. Now, wouldn't it be easy and wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a machine, an algorithm that we could simply hit a big red button, enter in a person's name that we want to research, and all of the information is presented to us, it's been analyzed, and it tells us instantly whether we should be doing business with this entity or not. Fact is, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And we always have to be aware when it comes to algorithms and processes like this, garbage in, garbage out. So the old computer adage goes. If we put the wrong information into the system, we're going to get the wrong information coming back out the other side. So it does require a high level of critical thinking. And the fact is, this is hard work. As Henry Ford, the great industrialist, said, thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably the reason why so few actually engage in this. So it is difficult work. It is potentially quite challenging work as well, but it is very, very important work. So with that, I'm going to stop this presentation and open this up to your questions. Again, my challenge here is to have you taking responsibility for doing a lot of this research yourself, and also being aware of your processes. My challenge is to think a little bit differently about how you go about doing this. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. That well, both of you have given such. You've opened the door on a whole range of very interesting topics that go well beyond the aspect of of chemical security. I mean, it applies across an array of issues that are confronting our interlinked and interconnected world that are real challenges. I'd like to at this point, just invite folks to use this format. We've got people on the line from Lebanon, Bangladesh, India, Iraq, Malaysia, Indonesia, all over. Please type in your questions to the Q&A. Yusuf is going to be monitoring them, and we want to turn quickly to those. This program is for you. Now, having said that, I'm going to take advantage of having the microphone while you ask put your own questions in and comments to just ask both of our speakers in our discussions earlier earlier in the week. David, you used the metaphor of an orchestra. And the idea, and I wonder if we could just pull that thread a little bit and get Stephen's comments as well. You both represent something that's really rare and valuable in that you've dived deep into subject matter, of various subject matters, but you've also in your career done a heck of a lot of engagement with partners across the world in multiple disciplines. And, having Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking or, one of the greats of physics is not necessarily, they are not necessarily the person who can boil it down and help a non-technical audience put their principles into their own context. Could you talk a little bit about that orchestra metaphor, David, and Stephen, maybe comment on just your experience in how to bring some of what David was talking about into that collaborative environment where people appreciate the interests of both public safety, oversight, regulation, and the economic realities of running a business.
Yeah, by all means, Tom. One thing I do want to point out is I noticed in the comment thread at about 20 minutes past the hour, somebody stated that the individuality among human elements is also a problem, building the understanding and relationships required in building sound and synergy on the chemical security. So this issue of human elements, I think, is what is really important here, is the application of behavioral science into all of this. In terms of the idea of conducting an orchestra, we have to consider how multidisciplinary this whole equation actually is. Over the years, I've been extraordinarily fortunate to be able to work around the world with many private and public sector organizations in many different sectors as well. So in the private sector, everything from brand protection, supply chain security, petrochemical industry, and so on. And one of the things that I found is that there is no one formula that works for absolutely everyone. And every time this is something I see repeatedly over and over again. When it comes to open source intelligence, we've talked about the internet, it's often seen as a computer issue. So what tends to happen is people that are good at network engineering, at computing sciences, they suddenly are considered to be the experts in how to find information online. I would suggest that that's probably more akin to library sciences, intelligence analysis, investigations, than it is to computer technology per se. You need to understand computer technology to be able to make it all work. That being said, think of it like a Formula One race car team. Because you've got someone that's extremely good at engineering and being a race car mechanic, putting them behind the driving wheel of that race car doesn't mean that they're going to be winning races. In fact, something terrible might happen. They're not a driver. So what we really have to do is assess the different skill sets that we have and bring all of those skill sets together, a merging of the technical expertise of a technical department with an intelligence-based organization as well. And this could even include things like business intelligence, getting as many people involved as possible. Now, again, coordinating all of that can be a little bit of a challenge.
Steve? Oh, you're on mute, Steve.
Forgot there. So to start with, I'd like to say I appreciate being discussed in the same context as Stephen Hawking and some of the others, and as well as Dave Toddington. But from my perspective, and I often come to these things from an education perspective. And Tom, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier. The notion that it's all great to have all of these pieces, whether it's information or experience or the technical side of things, but that needs to be brought together in a way that will make people understand. And I like the orchestra analogy. I also like the example that you and I talked about a little bit earlier, that you have to put all these ingredients together. You can have all these ingredients there, but unless you have somebody who understands the art of baking a cake or baking bread, that you're just going to have a pile of ingredients that don't turn into what you need. You need to have that ability to take what people have, put it into formats that people understand, consider the cultural aspects involved and the way that people learn, and look at each situation individually and be able to pass it on that way. A good conductor understands the vagaries of each part of the orchestra. A good baker understands that you need just a little bit more of a pinch of this than the recipe calls for in order to have something come out that everybody that suits everybody. So to me, it's very much about looking at what's in front of you and working with that. I mentioned earlier, again, Tom, to you, that you look at the list of participants in whether it's a training session or a session like this, and you look at what everybody's strengths are and what they bring to the table, and you have to be able to put things in a way that those folks understand.
I'll just add one comment to the metaphor, and that in the arena that we tend to focus on, the emerging, threat mitigation and getting benefits, economic opportunities while mitigating threats, particularly with emerging technologies and this rapid, the rapid increase in the ability to do different things with chemical engineering and different things with biological engineering and the advent of artificial intelligence. It's a little bit like conducting an orchestra without a conductor. We've all got our instruments and we got to collaborate, because there is no conductor. There's no blueprint that says this is exactly how we should all work together to create international norms and safety and so forth. We actually have to figure it out. And that makes it a little, now down the road, we may have, through norms, treaties, procedures, process, we might have a well agreed upon, like, David, you're an aviation specialist, ICAO has good airport procedures that everybody follows, and you don't have to really enforce it because everybody has an interest. We're not there yet on a number of these emerging technologies. Let me stop there, turn the request Yusuf, if you wouldn't mind hitting some of the things that have come up in Q&A and chat, and I'll put my microphone on mute.
Thank you, Tom. We have a couple of questions. I'd like to start with Bernard's question. How effective has responsible care been to improving the security situations in the chemical industry? And I'm guessing this is a question to Steve, because that's when this was written.
Sure. So I'll start by saying that I'm so pleased and proud that responsible care as a program was first begun in Canada some 35 plus years ago. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it is a program that's been developed as a voluntary compact, if you like, amongst chemical industries in relation to proper care, transportation, and usage of chemicals. How effective has it been? I can speak to what I have seen, how I have seen it being used in organizations, both in organizations that are collectives of chemical companies and those kinds of industry associations, but also more specifically in specific contexts of how companies have used it that I've seen, including the company that I was the head of corporate security for. We took the notion of responsible care very seriously. We subscribe to the audit program that is part of that, and looked as much as possible to implement it across the board inside the organization, both in the parts of the organization that dealt with outreach to customers, as well as the parts of the organization that dealt with production. Again, I think, as I said in my presentation, I think that these kinds of programs developed by industry have a real place inside the chemical industry. Has it been successful in the big picture? It's used in 65 plus countries. It's used by most of the major multinationals that I worked with. And I can tell you that the companies that I dealt with inside the business took it seriously. To me, that's a significant measure of success.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is, what's the initiation step for chemical security, supply chain security implementation for specifically critical chemical infrastructure? What is the role of regulatory agencies?
The role of regulatory agencies specifically, that's the nature of the question? Sorry, I didn't get a chance to look at it. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that it is important to the extent possible, that regulatory agencies can reach out to business to understand what business is looking for and what business needs with respect to supply chain security. I think I really believe that often the collaboration that could take place between business and government could take place, but for the fact that one side or the other doesn't want to reach out to the other. And from the government side, so I put on my past government regulator hat. What I find is really important is as a first step, is to take a little bit of time to understand the nature of the business, whether we're looking at a sector or a specific business. Going into starting something like supply chain security from the perspective of, you have to do this and you have to do that because we government think that's the right thing to do and because it's important public safety. That's all great. But I go back to my message of collaboration and understanding relationships, that a little bit of relationship building, a little bit of understanding that and sort of appreciating that business, while it's all about making money and moving business forward, has elements to it that are not all about making money and moving business forward. There are businesses, and there are parts of most businesses that I think that are truly interested in the whole safety issue if we're talking about supply chain security here. So I think a little bit of research and understanding, plus taking the initiative to reach out and say, look, we can work on this together. This can be a collaborative effort and it can work well for both of us, is a good place to start.
Thanks, Steve. If I may, I wanted to ask another question to use this opportunity. David, you showed a slide with the breakdown of English and other speakers around the world. We know now that Google now automatically translates your inquiries typed in another language and gives you the results in your own language. For example, if you are in the US and you Google Joe Biden in Russian characters, you're likely to get results in English since you're based in the US. Do you think that will change anything in how we conduct open search investigations?
Well, what's important to take into account, again, we always go back to those basics. What questions are we asking? How are we asking the questions? And where are we asking the questions? So if you were to take a name and then you were to translate that into Cyrillic characters and then conduct a search using Google with the default settings in Cyrillic characters, invariably, you are going to get Cyrillic web pages coming back with the option to translate that page into English, because one of the things that Google is doing, let's assume again, you're in the United States, your keyboard is set up to US English, Google detects that with your browser fingerprint, and it will make that available to you quite quickly and easily. What this does is it really broadens out your capabilities quite substantially, keeping in mind that if you're only searching in one language, you could be missing some really important things out there. Different search engines will do the job differently. If you are doing a search in Eastern Europe, in Russia, for example, on a Russian entity, I would recommend exploring the Yandex search engine. That's a Russian search engine that is going to be very much more localized to that area. So it's important to understand using a tool like Google. First of all, there's other search engines out there, and we can also set Google differently. So we could, your default settings, if you're in the United States, will be Google US. Go into settings, you can then select where you want to be searching. Let's say the UAE, for example. You could then be searching in the United Arab Emirates on Google, something we call filter bubbling. So you've got this location slant on what it is that you're searching. So again, there's more to Google than meets the eye, more than many other search engines as well. And we have to be really aware of this. These are just some of the little things that we need to be aware of to be able to search effectively.
Stephen, in your presentation, you you highlighted the basic principles and the importance, and you noted that, yeah, there are some areas where complexity is just there and you have to deal with it. For example, the cybersecurity threats. Could you, given the fact that, if major chemical producers of various kinds have a lot of automated systems that, control temperatures, control processes and flow and so forth, if you could, without breaching the physical security of a plant and setting off the alarm bells that would come from a physical breach, if you could remotely dial in and start messing with DuPont or Dow's, plant that makes something and do it in such a way that everything goes bang. What is the, what's the arc of evolution in the threat and countermeasure for cybersecurity as it relates to manufacturing and industrial processes?
I think it's certainly an area that is increasing rapidly. What I would say is that it's fairly far advanced, but for the notion that the bad guys are consistently advancing faster, and we are consistently having to respond to what the bad guys do in this regard. I can tell you that government state security agencies in a couple of realms have for years reached out to private industry, mine included, proactively, I might add, pleased to note, on the notion that that they appreciate that there are threat actors out there trying to enter into corporate computer systems to try and cause mischief or other kinds of commit other kinds of nefarious acts, but that government state security act organizations have reached out already to try and proactively address that issue inside corporate internal security and technical security departments. And I was pleased to see that they were proactive about that. And when I've spoken to them about that, all of them have said, we recognize that the chemical industry is a significant contributor to a nation's economy. So it's not just, can we go in and save this, help this business proactively deal with problems? If these problems occur and we as a government do not go in and try and help them out, this could be a significant drain on the national economy. So to answer your question, I think it's already there, because the issue is always one where we're dealing with it on a reactive basis to what the next new threat is. It tends to be thought of as we're just reacting, but it's the notion of that has been around for a bit now.
Thank you. And let me just draw on both of your law enforcement backgrounds and familiarity with police organizations to say, WMD, weapons of mass destruction and the chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, highly explosive, that realm, and the biological weapons treaty, the chemical, all of that was it emerged from a kind of state actor centric perspective. Like, let's all agree, the community of nations, let's all agree we're not going to use chemical weapons in battle. We're not going to use biological weapons in battle. And, huge chemical and biological production facilities were dismantled in various states. We now have a scenario where you're seeing chemical weapons pop up in different conflicts. You're also seeing some very exquisite chemical weapons being used for very specific assassination type, techniques and so forth. But my question is, it's still a very rare event compared to other things that law enforcement deals with every day, such as drugs, narcotics, trafficking. To what extent, in your experience, would a law enforcement officer who thinks he's looking for a meth lab, would he recognize a homemade chemical weapons production area? Or, perhaps there are better examples that you would have from your own experience, but to what extent does do the folks who are concerned about that rare but very high consequence event of a chemical weapons, or biological weapons, a WMD event, to what extent should law enforcement and the folks who might be the first responders to the first indicator of such an event happening or being cooked up, how much are they aware? How much knowledge do they need to have to be an important, element in preventing a catastrophe? David?
I think, again, I go back to saying, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. The pressure on police personnel is that they are expected to be generalists and yet experts at pretty much everything. Recognizing what doesn't look right and then knowing how to ask those questions is, I think, what's really important. Speaking from personal experience, and this goes back some 20 years, I was involved in a terrorist investigation. Was involved in actually doing the investigation, basically conducting a search under the authorization of a search warrant. And I was surprised at the time just how many resources came to bear very, very quickly. Many things that I knew nothing about at the time in terms of the manufacturing of shaped charges and explosives, and yet the resources all came together very, very quickly. So I think that, again, we can't be good at absolutely everything. In being a generalist, we just have to be aware, see what looks right, what looks wrong, and then ask a lot of questions. I don't know if that helps at all here, but I think it really speaks to what Steve mentioned just a little bit earlier, not just the science of investigation, but the art of an investigation as well.
Steve?
So, David very correctly points out that police officers are being asked to do more and more, and all of that said, my observations of where policing is going is that people entering the profession are more and more capable to take a wider view of what's in front of them. When I started in policing, the notion of coming across a drug operation was limited to, look, there's a bunch of marijuana sitting over there. And it becomes very obvious. And we've progressed through to police officers in the field having to have a broad recognition of what's out there, whether it's the computer-based tools that might facilitate a crime where they go in for something else, or the notion of drug labs and precursors sitting around. I think police officers generally have become much more sophisticated in that. What I would say is that in my experience, again, through CRDF, in dealing with police officers in multiple different countries, is that I would say that my experience is that police officers outside of North America are a little more perhaps apt at seeing that in front of them because they've had more experience in seeing those kinds of things in front of them. David, I don't know, would you agree with that in your realm?
Yeah, I would. There was a question that just came in actually on the question line here from David Campbell, who's a former member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And he says most frontline police officers have basic training in both clandestine laboratories and bombs, such as IEDs, to be aware of precursors, etc. For WMD, few officers on the front line have the knowledge and skills to recognize immediate threats. I would absolutely concur with that. And that's speaking from a Canadian federal policing perspective. So it's not always going to be something that's going to be applicable in many countries in the world where standards are going to be quite different.
Yeah, and given the rarity of the events, you not necessarily want to train every police officer to recognize precursors, but boy, it sure is helpful if you create an environment where they can phone a friend, and do it and have that sense of, okay, I know who to call. This doesn't look like what I expected. I'm not sure what it is, but I can reach back. And that's the part that, probably it goes back to Steve's point of, it's a collaboration. People need to work together, and that expert who identifies it, the closest expert might, to a local situation, might not be law enforcement or security. It might be an industry person, and you pull in that industry person because you have a relationship with the industry. And he is able to come and or she is able to come and do the analysis and tell you, yeah, this is a nerve agent.
And I think a lot of the expertise there and the ability to see that kind of thing is contextual. Certainly, the police officers that I've dealt with in Iraq are much more capable at a frontline level of understanding what's in front of them that might be a precursor to a WMD than those in Europe, for example, or in North America.
Yeah, and to tag on to that, to Steve's point, the chemical industry, yourselves working in the chemical industry, you may recognize things that your government public safety agencies may not recognize because of your expertise. And that's an interesting perspective, isn't it? When you may detect things that government agencies are unable to detect, or they just don't notice. And you could be in a position where you actually see something happening and it could be important.
But it's interesting you say that. As part of my chemical security role as a corporate security director, I went to visit one of our storage facilities in Brazil. And I know that the police had been through there because I had the opportunity to meet with them at points during my travels down there. But when I went into this facility and I asked the facility manager, because I had been told that in our organization, we were getting out of the business of holding stocks of ammonium nitrate. And I asked the facility director if we carried ammonium nitrate at all, just to try and see what the answer would be. He said, well, of course we do. And he took me around the back of the shed, the storage shed, and I saw these giant piles of ammonium nitrate sitting there, knowing full well that police officers had been through there and had not recognized it for what it was, or not even asked the question.
Yusuf, what's our time frame? Are we good until 10? Sorry.
We're actually out of time. already.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Any final burning desires and questions from the audience, or would you like to make any closing question or comment, Yusuf?
We have quite a few comments and questions. I'll ask Steve and David. Do you have time for another question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Let me go back to the top. So Peter is asking, in your country, I'm guessing he means Canada, is chemical security nationally governed by any legislative and regulatory framework?
There are a number of different legislative frameworks that could include chemical security, and in fact, that's in addition to sort of the standard kinds of dangerous goods transportation regulations that are out there. I noted recently, I counted them up because I had to put them together for a presentation, that in Canada I found 20, and in the US I found 35 different pieces of legislation that relate to chemical security, from customs regulation to transportation, all across the map. Is there one single piece of legislation? No. And I would find it very difficult to find a place where there is one single piece of legislation. I think we are, hampered isn't the right word, but I think that we always have to recognize that there are a number of different pieces of legislation that have to deal with chemical security, and that's always going to be one of the challenges.
Thank you, Steve. I want to ask the last question, and it's to David. It's in the chat. In terms of reliability of information that we find, which one is more reliable, deep web or surface web?
It's impossible to answer a question in very general terms like that, because when we go out onto the surface web, we can find absolutely anything. And this is what we have to be careful of, as I mentioned, with regards to the quote about we're going to find what it is we're looking for. We've got to be careful how we ask the questions and how we strategize our searches. When it comes to the deep web, we could be dealing with databases. The question we always ask is, how does this source of information know this information? So we apply something called the CARS checklist. We ask credibility, accuracy, reasonableness, and support of the information that we wind up finding as well. So again, this is where the strategy of all of this is really quite important. There is no one way of saying one is going to be more reliable as a source of information than the other. The surface web is just far too broad to be able to do that. One thing I will maybe just say at the end of this is it's very important, and again, this is my challenge, is not to start relying on checklists. And when I say checklists, what I mean is the same way of doing things over and over and over. Keep in mind that you could be dealing with people who are very intelligent, very clever, and they are doing everything to deceive you, to create synthetic identities, as we call them, to be able to make purchases where chemicals are then going to go off to exactly the wrong people. So keep this in mind every step of the way. It's not enough to just say, well, we've got a process, here's the checklist, and we've got people that just simply go through the checklist and look for the information and check the boxes, we're good. It's not good enough. We really have to approach this from the perspective of purpose and curiosity as well.
Well, great comment to end on. And although I'm normally happy to abuse the time of our participants, when I think of some guy in a downed airplane out there in the woods around in the mountains that we're keeping David from going and rescuing, that I feel like we should probably end it and let him go. Stephen, David, thank you so much. All of our guests from around the world, thank you for tuning in. Yusuf, this has been fantastic. CRDF Global is a nonprofit organization that has been around for 26 years now, and every day is different. You know, that cooperative threat reduction evolution, you know, what we started with back in 1995, it evolves all the time. And we've gotten into areas of, you know, global health and international visitor exchanges and cybersecurity. And what is so apparent to me, you know, when I apply my own critical thinking effort, is the convergence of all of these areas and the effort that, you know, there is no omniscient and all-powerful conductor. The community of nations, we have to come together. We have to talk and collaborate and come up with some solutions to get the best benefits out of all the good things that come from chemicals and other, you know, biologicals and everything else, while preventing as best as we can the potential for a horrible consequence. And that is what we are about. And we're only successful if we have people like you two to help us, and of course the foreign participants who are on the call today. Thank you very much, and hope the weather turns pretty out there in Vancouver. And I'm so glad that we were able to keep the connection throughout the presentation.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a real pleasure.
Be well.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
Bye all.